In the heart of Victorian England lies a chilling tale of a cursed doll, the spirit of a child trapped in porcelain, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Dr. Thomas Keene inherits Briar Abbey, he thinks he's escaping grief, but the house has a darker purpose, one tied to his own bloodline. His daughter, Imogen, unwittingly awakens an ancient evil sealed within a doll, leading to a terrifying battle for survival. As the doll whispers in Latin and controls her every move, Thomas must face the demon within and sacrifice everything to protect his daughter. Will he succeed, or will the cursed doll consume them both? Dr. Thomas Keene had always prided himself on his logical, scientific mind. A man of reason, he'd never placed stock in the supernatural. So, when he inherited Briar Abbey, a dark and imposing Victorian estate left to him by a distant relative, he believed the only thing awaiting him was a chance to escape the grief of losing his wife. The house, with its damp halls and empty rooms, felt like nothing more than an inconvenience at first, just another place to sell or renovate. But the Abbey was hiding something far more sinister. In the nursery, where his daughter, Imogen, had begun to explore, an ancient doll lay forgotten, locked away, untouched for years. As soon as Imogen found it, strange things began to happen. The doll whispered to her in archaic Latin, its voice an eerie, childlike hum that filled the house. The child, once playful and full of life, became distant. Her personality changed, her words twisted. Unbeknownst to Thomas, the doll wasn't haunted. It was a demon, trapped in a child's toy, waiting for the right moment to break free. And now, it wanted more than Imogen. It wanted him. With every whispered word and every twisted glance, the demon drew Thomas closer to a horrifying fate. In a desperate race against time, Thomas must uncover the chilling secrets of the Abbey, sacrifice everything he holds dear, and stop the demon before it claims his soul and Imogen's forever. Don't miss the chilling story of Briar Abbey, the doll, and a family trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Story number 1. The fog rolled thick over Victorian London, turning the gas lamps into weak, bleeding halos in the night. Eleanor Blythe had never seen the city like this. Raised in the cold orphanage of St. Michael's, she'd spent most of her life sheltered from the world outside. But now, standing at the threshold of a dark, crumbling toy shop, she felt as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something she wasn't yet prepared for. She had inherited the shop from a man she'd never known, her uncle William Blythe, a mysterious, distant figure who had passed away weeks before she was notified of her inheritance. The letter that arrived was short and cold, a formal decree with a signature she had no memory of. And now, Eleanor found herself standing in front of a shop that had sat abandoned for years, its windows cracked and its doors locked with dust and sorrow. Inside, the air smelled like mothballs and old wood. The floor creaked beneath her boots as she moved deeper into the shop, her fingers brushing the shelves stacked with forgotten toys, cracked marionettes, tarnished wind-up soldiers, stuffed bears with one eye missing. But it was the glass cabinet at the back of the room that drew her in. Inside it, nestled against a bed of velvet, was a doll. The doll was different. She had a porcelain face, painted with such detail it almost seemed alive. Her eyes, though glassy, seemed to stare right into Eleanor's soul. The doll's lips were curved into an eerie half-smile, and her hair, though made of fine threads, looked like it could have been real, if it weren't for the unnerving stillness of it. Eleanor pressed her fingers against the glass, feeling an odd pulse under her skin. It was like the doll was waiting for something, or someone. The shop seemed alive in a way that made her skin crawl. She'd never believed in ghosts or curses. Those were things children whispered about on dark nights. But standing in that room, She felt something pressing against her, something old and powerful. The doll's presence was unmistakable. Days passed, and Eleanor began to sift through the forgotten corners of the shop. She found stacks of old letters and journals hidden away in the back office. Most of them were written by her uncle, but one journal, bound in faded leather, stood out. It belonged to a man named Victor Blythe, the original doll maker. As Eleanor read, she learned of his tragic tale. Victor had lost his daughter Lisette to a terrible illness when she was just a child. His grief drove him to madness, and he became obsessed with creating the perfect doll, a doll that could replace his lost daughter. He poured all of his love, and perhaps something darker, into the creation of Lisette's porcelain twin. But as he completed the doll, he had a terrifying revelation. The doll wasn't merely a replica. It was something more, something alive. The final pages of the journal were smeared with ink, as if the writer had been frantic, terrified. He spoke of a curse, a price paid for bringing the dead back to life. And there, written in trembling hands, was the most chilling part of all. I have trapped her soul inside the doll, but I cannot undo it. She has become something more, something dangerous. The curse will pass on to my heirs. They will carry it, just as I did, and they will never escape it. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. Her hands trembled as she put the journal down. She had always been curious about her family's past, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, like the rustling of silk, but by the second night, the voice had grown louder, clearer. It was the doll, speaking to her in the silence of her sleep. Eleanor, you are my creator. You are my salvation. The voice was gentle, but there was something in it that felt wrong. The words slid into her dreams like poison, and she woke each morning with a headache, her mind fogged with strange visions of the doll, of Lisette, of something dark and terrible. She tried to ignore it, to continue with her work, but the whispers only grew more insistent. The first death came suddenly. A regular customer, a kindly old man named Mr. Hargrove, the antique dealer who had helped her settle into the shop, was found dead in his home. His body was twisted, his face frozen in an expression of fear. His eyes, wide and staring, looked just like the doll's. Eleanor couldn't breathe when she saw his face, pale and lifeless. It was as if the doll had taken him, twisted him into something unrecognizable. Then it happened again. Another victim. A woman, Mrs. Abernathy, who had visited the shop only days before, was found dead, her face contorted in terror. Her body laid out in an almost identical pose to that of the doll. Each death mirrored a customer from the shop, each one connected to the cursed dolls. Eleanor was paralyzed by fear. The doll, the porcelain thing she had thought of as an innocent creation, was no longer a mere object. It was something else, something alive. And it was watching her. It was waiting. Eleanor sought answers from Father Don, a priest who had once visited the shop, intrigued by the rumors of its dark history. When he saw the doll, his face turned ashen. He spoke of the occult, of curses that could never be undone, of souls trapped in eternal torment. The doll, he revealed, was the vessel of Lisette's soul. The curse was tied to her, a curse that would pass down to Eleanor, for she was the dollmaker's granddaughter. You were always destined to carry it, Father Don whispered, his voice trembling. You must destroy the doll, or you will become like the others, trapped in its curse forever. But how could Eleanor destroy the thing that seemed to hold her destiny? She had no choice. No escape. Days later, Eleanor was found in the shop, her eyes vacant, her body stiff and unmoving. She sat in front of the glass cabinet, surrounded by dozens of porcelain dolls, each one eerily lifelike, each one resembling a victim of the curse. One doll stood in the center, its face a perfect replica of Eleanor's own. The whispers had stopped, but Eleanor was gone. Story number 2. Lady Evelyn Whitmore had never been one for superstition. A noblewoman by birth and a realist by choice, she held no time for ghost stories or legends. When her husband, Lord Whitmore, passed away 2 years ago, leaving her and her daughter Clara in their grand manor, Evelyn had to fight to keep the house standing, both literally and financially. The estate auction she attended one cold October afternoon was just another attempt to find something that might fill the empty spaces in the old mansion, and perhaps her heart. It was there, amidst piles of dusty relics and forgotten treasures, that she found it. A Victorian doll. Porcelain skin, painted with delicate precision, its eyes wide and empty. The auctioneer had referred to it as a rare piece, an antique that had passed through generations of an old, wealthy family. Evelyn had no interest in the doll itself, but Clara, her curious daughter, had gazed at it for what felt like hours. "Mother," Clara had whispered, her voice almost pleading. "Please, I want it." Evelyn, distracted by the much more expensive paintings and furniture, had bought it for her daughter without much thought. It wasn't until later that she would begin to regret that decision. At first, it seemed harmless. Clara, a bright and playful child of 10, placed the doll in her room and promptly ignored it in favor of her books and games. But over time, Evelyn noticed something strange. Clara spent more and more time with the doll, speaking to it in soft whispers that Evelyn couldn't quite make out. It was when Clara's behavior started changing that Evelyn grew concerned. At dinner one evening, Clara sat at the table, but her usual lively chatter was gone. She was quieter, her hands trembling as she held her fork. Her face, usually flushed with youth, was pale. Her eyes, those large blue eyes Evelyn had always adored, began to look different. Not the kind of different that comes with a fever or exhaustion. No, there was something deeply unsettling about them. Sometimes they even seemed to shine. "I'm fine, Mother," Clara said in a low voice, the kind that Evelyn didn't recognize. "I just need to rest." But Clara didn't rest. She spent every moment with that doll, and Evelyn noticed something else. Servants began to vanish. First, it was Miss Andrews, the cook. Then, Mr. Simon, the stableman. They had been with the Whitmores for years, and one by one they simply disappeared. The household staff was small, but Evelyn could hardly ignore it when James, the loyal but superstitious servant, mentioned it. "Lady Whitmore, have you seen the strange marks on the walls?" James asked one evening, his face pale. "It's as if something's been scratched into the stone." Evelyn had dismissed it as nothing more than the old house settling, but that night, when she passed by Clara's room, she saw it for herself. Strange symbols, carved deep into the manor's ancient walls. Symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She shuddered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Clara's transformation didn't stop there. Her voice deepened like it wasn't her own. She would stare at the doll with an eerie, unfocused gaze. At times, she would laugh softly, though no one had spoken to her. And worst of all, Clara's eyes. Those eyes. They had changed completely. The once blue depths now appeared to glow with an unnatural porcelain white. Evelyn tried to approach her daughter, but Clara only flinched away. The fear that had been gnawing at Evelyn's insides now grew into a full-blown terror. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Dr. Wren, an occult scholar whom Evelyn had once considered nothing more than a curious intellectual, became her last hope. He arrived at the manor with his books and old tomes, muttering to himself as he examined the symbols on the walls. He turned to Evelyn, his face pale. "This is no ordinary doll," Dr. Wren said, his voice low and shaky. "It's a vessel, Lady Whitmore. A vessel for Azariah." "Azariah?" Evelyn asked, her voice shaking. "The demon," Dr. Wren explained, pulling a weathered book from his bag. "Azariah was trapped in this doll after a seance gone horribly wrong. The demon is bound to the porcelain, unable to fully manifest in the world of the living. But that was centuries ago. The demon has been waiting for a new vessel." Evelyn's heart dropped into her stomach. "You mean Clara?" Dr. Wren nodded gravely. "Clara is being possessed. Azariah is using her as a vessel for rebirth. If you don't act fast, your daughter will be lost forever." The next few days were a blur of desperation. Evelyn locked herself in Clara's room, trying to reason with her daughter, but it was no use. Clara's voice no longer sounded like her own. It was deep, guttural, like the very air had been ripped from her lungs. "I don't want to die, Mother," Clara said one night, her porcelain eyes glistening unnaturally in the candlelight. "I want to live forever, and Azariah will help me." Evelyn felt the last shred of hope slip away as Clara smiled, a smile too wide, too wrong. The manor burned down on a stormy night, as if the house itself had become a living thing, unwilling to hold the demon any longer. It had been quick, too quick. Evelyn never even had the chance to escape with her daughter. The flames consumed the walls, the symbols, the dolls, everything. And then, silence. The smoke cleared, leaving nothing but charred remnants and ash where the Whitmore estate had once stood. But as the fire was extinguished, something was discovered among the ruins. The doll, Azariah. Miraculously untouched by the flames, its porcelain eyes still gleamed white. Years passed, and the world moved on. But when another estate auction came around, a familiar object appeared on the table. Once again, a Victorian doll, its eyes empty and cold. Only this time, the auctioneer's words carried a heavier weight. "This doll, ladies and gentlemen, is an item of great historical significance. It's said to have come from the Whitmore estate, and it's very rare." The doll's porcelain eyes glinted in the light, and for the first time in years, someone unaware, raised their hand. Azariah was waiting again. Story number 3. In the quiet countryside, nestled far from the nearest village, stood Briarwood Orphanage. It was an old stone building, its walls thick and gray with the weight of years. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the wind often whispered through the trees that lined the property. To most, it was just a place, a cold, forgotten part of the world where unwanted children were left to grow up in silence. Ada, a clever and curious orphan, had spent most of her life in Briarwood. She knew the routines of the orphanage well, the long hours of silence, the strict rules from Miss Elowin, the headmistress, and the endless days of waiting for someone to adopt her. But she also knew how to look beyond what was expected. Ada watched people. She paid attention to every small detail, the way the wind shifted, the way the floorboards creaked, the way Miss Elowin's eyes flickered when she spoke of her past. Everything changed the day the inventor came. It was an unusually warm afternoon when a man named Mr. Theobald arrived at Briarwood. He was tall, with wiry glasses that sat too low on his nose, and his coat was worn in places that hinted at a life of travel. The children had gathered outside when he presented the gift. a mechanical Victorian doll. "Miss Pennyfeather," Mr. Theobald said with pride as he wound up a small key at the back of the doll, "she's my masterpiece, a companion for your children. She can walk, talk, and even think for herself. She's almost alive." The doll was dressed in an old-fashioned dress with pale porcelain skin and wide, glassy eyes. Her hair, though made of wire, looked as if it could move like real hair. Miss Pennyfeather's smile, though fixed and artificial, seemed almost comforting. As she began to move, her joints clicking softly, the children gasped in awe. "She's beautiful," whispered Peter, Ada's closest friend, his eyes wide with wonder. "She can talk too?" Mr. Theobald smiled. "Indeed, she can even carry on conversations. Go ahead, ask her something." The children surrounded the doll, asking her everything from her name to her favorite color. Miss Pennyfeather responded politely, her voice a soft, mechanical hum. The children adored her. They followed her around the yard, watched her perform tricks, and marveled at how lifelike she seemed. For a moment, Ada wondered how much of this was truly magic, and how much of it was something darker. It started with small things. At first, there were whispers in the night. Then it was the sounds of creaking floorboards as the children slept. Ada would hear the faintest click of gears in the dark, as if someone, or something, was moving just out of sight. But when she would get up to check, there was nothing but the shadows and the soft hum of the old house. The disappearances started soon after. It was Peter who vanished first. One morning, he was simply gone. His bed was empty, the covers neatly folded as if he had never slept there. At first, Miss Elowin insisted it was just a case of him running away, but Ada didn't believe that. She knew Peter. He wouldn't have left without a word. The other children whispered about strange things they had seen. Miss Pennyfeather standing alone in the hallway, her eyes seeming to follow them, her mechanical movements unnaturally smooth. Some said they had heard her talking to herself, though no one had dared to get close enough to hear what she was saying. Then, one by one, the children began to disappear. Ada had always been clever, always watching, always thinking. She began to suspect that Miss Pennyfeather wasn't just a doll. She had started to see changes in her. Small things at first, like the way her smile seemed to grow more natural, how her eyes became more expressive, less glassy. And then, one day, Miss Pennyfeather reached out and touched a child's cheek, her fingers soft and warm. Ada's suspicion grew. She began to watch the doll closely. What she saw next confirmed her worst fears. Miss Pennyfeather was no longer just a doll. She was becoming something else. One evening, Ada sneaked into Miss Elowin's study. She had overheard the headmistress speaking to Reverend Marsh, their voices low and hurried. The words that reached Ada's ears were enough to send a chill down her spine. "It's working, Elowin," Reverend Marsh said. "The doll is absorbing the souls of the children. Soon she will be human." Ada froze. The headmistress's voice trembled as she responded. "But my daughter, my Lily, I've waited so long to bring her back. If I can just finish the process, she'll live again." Ada's heart pounded in her chest. The headmistress had used forbidden alchemy to bring her daughter back, by turning the children into fuel for the doll's transformation. The doll wasn't just a companion. She was a vessel, a puppet, and every child who disappeared gave her more life, more humanity. The more children she took, the more real she became. By the time Ada realized the full extent of the horror, it was too late. The last child, a quiet boy named Samuel, was already gone. Miss Pennyfeather, now almost completely human in appearance, stood in the center of the room, her eyes glinting with a strange, unnatural light. "Miss Pennyfeather?" Ada whispered, her voice trembling. What have you done?" The doll turned her head, her smile widening in a way that no doll's smile should ever widen. "I've become real," she said, her voice no longer mechanical but deep, rich, and full of feeling. "And now, you're the last one." Ada's hands shook, but she knew what she had to do. In the dead of night, with the mansion eerily quiet around her, Ada took the final step. She had found the matches in the kitchen and crept back to the room where Miss Pennyfeather stood waiting. The doll's eyes followed her every movement, gleaming in the dim light. "Please don't," Miss Pennyfeather said softly. "You don't have to do this. I just wanted to live." But Ada was resolute. She struck the match, lighting the corner of the curtains, and the flames quickly spread. Miss Pennyfeather screamed, but her voice was no longer human. It was a shrill, mechanical wail, filled with sorrow and rage. The fire consumed the room, the doll shriveling in the heat, her porcelain skin cracking and falling away. But as Ada backed away from the flames, she saw something terrible. In the reflection of the window, her own eyes were wide and glassy, exactly like Miss Pennyfeather's. The fire burned hot, but Ada knew the truth. Miss Pennyfeather hadn't been the only one to change. She had, too. The flames roared louder as the last orphan, Ada, watched her own reflection vanish into the inferno. Story number 4. Lydia Marsh had always believed in logic. She was the type of person who measured twice and cut once, who relied on facts and reason. A widow for the past 3 years, she had moved with her young daughter Rose into a large, creaky, Victorian townhouse in the heart of London. The house was beautiful, despite its age, and Lydia thought it would be the perfect place to start fresh. It needed work, of course, a few renovations here and there, but that was something she could handle. She'd never imagined that the house would bring more than just the inconvenience of broken pipes and cracked plaster. She never imagined it would bring something else. It started with the fireplace. Lydia had hired Theo, a local renovation worker, to help with the major repairs. He was a burly man with a soft voice and a quiet way about him, someone who'd done his share of work in old homes. The first time they removed the old, soot-blackened fireplace, Lydia felt a chill, not from the draft, but from something else, a strange, heavy stillness that filled the air. Behind the crumbling brick, they found something odd. A door, or rather, a wall that had been sealed shut with mortar, as if someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever lay behind it. Lydia stood in front of it for a long moment, considering whether or not to open it. "I don't like it," Theo had said, his voice low. Sealed rooms in old houses aren't always a good thing. But Lydia was curious. Curiosity had always been her driving force. She couldn't leave it alone. "I'll take a look," she said, already finding the small cracks in the mortar that would allow her to pry it open. The bricks came away easily, revealing a narrow, dark space beyond. It smelled damp and musty, like something had been sealed away for far too long. And then, in the gloom, Lydia saw it. A large wooden box nailed to the wall. When she removed the box, something else was inside. A doll. It was no larger than a child's plaything, but its porcelain face was cracked, its hair matted and clumped, and its clothes, frayed and old, looked as if they had been worn by a ghost. For a moment, Lydia stared at the doll, unsure of what to think. She picked it up carefully, inspecting it. There was something unsettling about its glass eyes. They seemed too lifelike, too knowing. But she shrugged it off. It was just an old, forgotten doll, probably left behind by a previous tenant. She set the doll aside, not realizing the trouble she had just uncovered. That night, after Rose had gone to bed, the house seemed different. The air was heavy, thick with an unexplainable tension. Lydia tried to focus on her work, but something felt wrong. The floorboards creaked in strange places, and the walls, once still, now seemed to whisper. She shook it off, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. And then, in the silence of the night, Lydia heard it. A soft sound, like a child's laugh, distant but unmistakable. When she went to check on Rose, she found her sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room with wide, terrified eyes. "Mama," Rose whispered, her voice trembling. "The doll, it moved." Lydia felt her stomach drop. She turned on the light, but the doll was still where she had left it on the shelf. There was no sign of movement, no change at all. But Rose's expression, pale, wide-eyed, spoke volumes. Lydia told her it was just a bad dream, but she couldn't shake the growing unease that crept into her bones. The next day, the drawings began. At first, it was innocent, just doodles, little scribbles that Rose often did when she was lost in thought. But as the days passed, the drawings became more disturbing. Rose began to cover pages with strange symbols drawn in red. At first, Lydia thought it was just crayon, until she saw the stains on Rose's fingers. It wasn't crayon, it was blood. Lydia's heart raced as she tried to make sense of it. Rose had always been an imaginative child, but this was different. "Rose," Lydia asked, her voice strained with fear, "where did you get this?" "I didn't mean to," Rose whispered, her eyes wide. It's her, the doll. She told me to draw them." Lydia felt her breath catch in her throat. The doll, the one she had found hidden behind the wall. It wasn't just a doll, it was something far worse. The more Lydia looked into the doll, the more she realized the truth. The house seemed to hold secrets she hadn't imagined. She began to search through old local records, hiring Professor Ambrose, a historian who specialized in the occult, to help her unravel the mystery. "It's not just a doll," Professor Ambrose explained one evening, his voice heavy with dread. "It's a vessel. It was used in occult experiments by a secret society in London, a group of men who believed they could trap spirits in physical objects. This doll was supposed to hold the spirit of a little girl who died in 1849, Annalise. But something went wrong. The experiments were never completed. The spirit was never released." Lydia's hands shook as she listened. "So, what happens now?" Professor Ambrose looked at her gravely. "The curse was sealed with the doll. Removing it from the wall, the way you did, has released the spirit. It's now free, but it doesn't just want freedom. It wants a new vessel. It wants to live again." Lydia turned pale. "Rose, she's the vessel, isn't she?" Ambrose nodded. "It's worse than you think. Rose is the spirit's reincarnation. The doll is trying to take her." Lydia couldn't sit idle anymore. Desperation set in. She tried everything, burning the doll, burying it deep in the earth, but nothing worked. The strange symbols kept appearing on the walls, and Rose's behavior grew more and more erratic. She started speaking in a voice that wasn't hers. The spirit of Annalise was taking hold. In the dead of night, with the house filled with strange sounds and the walls seeming to close in on her, Lydia made a decision. She would entomb herself and Rose behind the wall where the doll had been, hidden where the curse began. With trembling hands, Lydia placed the doll back in the wall and began to seal it shut. Brick by brick, she pressed Rose to her chest, whispering to her as she worked. She had to keep her daughter safe, no matter the cost. But as the last brick was laid, As the final layer of mortar was spread, Lydia felt something cold and unyielding press against her. She turned to see the wall beginning to crumble. The curse wasn't finished, and neither was the doll. Story number 5. Isla Merton had always loved art. Since she was a little girl, she had spent hours drawing, painting, sculpting anything she could get her hands on. So, when she was offered a chance to become an apprentice to the famous doll maker, Mr. Falk, she didn't hesitate. The opportunity was too good to pass up. After all, Falk's dolls were legendary, beautiful, lifelike creations that were said to never age. She had heard the rumors, of course, whispers in the village about the strange, reclusive doll maker who lived in his manor on the edge of town. People said he was eccentric, obsessed with perfection. But none of that mattered to Isla. She was determined to learn from the best. The manor was old, its wooden floors creaking underfoot, its windows covered in dust. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a decaying relic of a time-long past. But it was inside these crumbling walls that Isla began her apprenticeship. Mr. Falk was an imposing figure, tall and thin, with a graying beard that reached down to his chest. He was a man of few words. He spoke softly, but his voice carried an undeniable authority. His eyes were cold, almost lifeless, except when he talked about his work. That was when they came alive, gleaming with a disturbing kind of passion. Isla had never seen anyone so dedicated to their craft. Mr. Falk worked tirelessly in his workshop, crafting his dolls with a level of precision and care that seemed impossible. Every stitch, every joint, every strand of hair was meticulously placed. They were perfect, too perfect. And the strangest part? They never seemed to age. The first time Isla asked about it, Mr. Falk had simply smiled and said, "Time is an illusion, my dear. These dolls are built to defy it." Isla was fascinated, but she didn't ask more. She was eager to learn. One day, while Mr. Falk was busy in the workshop, Isla's curiosity led her to explore the manor. She had always been told that the place was full of hidden rooms, forgotten corners, and long-forgotten secrets. It wasn't long before she found one. It was a small, dusty door at the back of the manor, tucked away behind a heavy curtain. The door was locked, but it didn't take much for Isla to find the key. She slid it into the lock and turned it, her heart racing with excitement. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with the scent of wax and decay. At first, Isla thought she had stumbled upon some forgotten storage space. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw something far worse. The walls were lined with what looked like lifelike figures, bodies frozen in time, their skin smooth and unmarked. They looked like dolls, but they weren't dolls. They were girls. Isla's breath caught in her throat. Some were young, others were older, but all of them had the same blank, lifeless eyes. Their bodies were carefully posed, their hands resting at their sides, their legs tucked neatly beneath them. They looked like they had been preserved, as if they were just waiting to wake up. As she took a step closer, Isla noticed something else. The faces of the figures. They looked familiar. Not familiar in the way a face might belong to someone you've seen in town, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. A terrible thought crept into Isla's mind, and she knew, in that moment, that she had uncovered a horrifying secret. Mr. Falk wasn't just a doll maker. He was a man who had turned girls into dolls. He wasn't crafting lifeless figures. He was preserving them. He was making them immortal. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to leave, but as she moved, a voice called out to her. "Isla!" The voice was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was clear. Isla froze. The voice came from one of the figures, a girl with golden hair and pale skin. Her eyes glazed over like all the others. But this girl's mouth moved. Slowly, deliberately. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. Isla's pulse raced. She backed away, her legs shaking, but she couldn't take her eyes off the figure. The girl's mouth moved again. "Beatrice," she said, her voice cracking. I was alive." Later that evening, Isla confronted Mr. Falk. She demanded answers, but he merely smiled, as if he had been expecting this moment. He led her into his workshop, where a new doll, one he had been working on for weeks, sat on the table. The doll was perfect, just like all the others, but there was something different about this one. This doll looked like Isla. The same hair, the same eyes. It was her. "You see, Isla," Mr. Falk said, his voice soft but firm. "I lost my daughter years ago. Beatrice was the perfect child, sweet, obedient, beautiful. She was my masterpiece. But when she died, I couldn't let go. So I brought her back, piece by piece. I captured others too to rebuild her. But you—" His voice trailed off. "You are the final piece." Isla's eyes widened in horror as the realization hit her. The girls in the waxen room. Beatrice's replacements. The dolls were never dolls. They were once real girls, and now they were trapped in an eternal sleep. And Isla was to be the last. That night, as Isla lay in bed, her mind raced with panic and fear. She couldn't escape. Mr. Falk would never let her go. He had spent years creating his masterpiece, and she was going to be the final doll, the final piece of his twisted creation. But Isla was not one to give up easily. She had learned enough from her time as Mr. Falk's apprentice to know how his workshop worked, to understand the secrets hidden in his strange craft. And she wasn't going to let him finish his work. Isla set the workshop on fire. The flames spread quickly, engulfing the manor in a roaring inferno. The crackling of the fire was deafening, but Isla didn't look back. She knew she had to destroy everything. Destroy Mr. Falk's creations, his twisted obsession with perfection. But as the fire raged, Isla stumbled across the last thing she had feared. Amidst the smoke and heat, there, on the table, was a doll. A perfect replica of herself. Its glassy eyes stared back at her, and to her horror, she saw its pupils shift. The doll moved, the manor burned to the ground, leaving nothing but charred remains. But Isla knew, deep down, that Mr. Falk's work would never truly end. His creations, his cursed dolls, would live on, immortal, forever trapped between life and death. And somewhere in the ashes, Isla could still hear Beatrice's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me." Story number 6. Marianne Bell had always been drawn to the past. As a child, she'd spent hours combing through dusty antiques at estate sales, marveling at the history held within the worn-out furniture and tarnished silverware. It was no surprise, then, that she found herself drawn to the Victorian dollhouse when it appeared in the auction catalog. Victor, her husband, had been less enthusiastic. "It's just a dollhouse, Marianne. A fancy one, but still, just a dollhouse," he had said, shaking his head as he glanced at the image of the piece in the catalog. But Marianne had been determined. There was something about the dollhouse that called to her, a feeling she couldn't explain. The dollhouse was an exact replica of a grand Victorian manor that had burned down decades ago, long before Marianne and Victor were born. The detail was impeccable, right down to the tiny portraits on the walls and the miniature furniture. It seemed almost alive, as though it were waiting to be completed. The auction had been fierce, but in the end, Marianne had won. Victor had reluctantly agreed to help transport the dollhouse into their home, a sprawling estate in the countryside. It arrived in several heavy crates, and the moment they set it up in their parlor, something felt wrong. The first sign that something wasn't right came that very night. Marianne stood in front of the dollhouse, admiring its craftsmanship. It was beautiful. Too beautiful. She gazed at the tiny rooms, the miniature figures frozen in place, caught in time. But there was something unsettling about the way the dolls were arranged. When she leaned closer, she saw it. 2 tiny figures standing in the parlor, exactly where she and Victor were sitting. The dolls were identical to them. Marianne blinked, unsure if it was her imagination. But no, the figures were too perfect, too real. They even wore the same clothes she and Victor had been wearing when they arrived home. "Victor," she called, her voice trembling. "Come here." He stepped into the room and looked at the dollhouse. "What is it now?" "I think it's us," she whispered, pointing at the miniature figures. Victor chuckled, but it was a nervous sound. "It's just a dollhouse, Marianne. Don't start letting it get to you." But that night, as Marianne lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The dolls had been too lifelike, and when she closed her eyes, she could almost swear she heard soft whispers, faint and unintelligible, coming from the dollhouse. The next day, the first death occurred. Mrs. Duskin, the maid who had worked for the Bells for years, was found dead in the garden. Her body was crumpled on the ground, as though she had simply collapsed. Marianne was shaken, but Victor assured her it was just a coincidence. "People died every day," he said. "Accidents happened." But Marianne couldn't shake the eerie connection. Later, as she was cleaning up the parlor, she noticed something new in the dollhouse. A new figure had appeared, another tiny person standing in one of the rooms. Marianne gasped. The doll was a miniature version of Mrs. Duskin. It wasn't just a coincidence. As days passed, more figures appeared in the dollhouse, and with each one, someone close to Marianne and Victor died. A neighbor, a friend, a local shopkeeper. Each time, a new figure appeared in the house. The figures seemed to grow more detailed, more lifelike with each death, and each time one of them appeared, someone was taken from the real world. Victor started to notice it too. He grew more nervous with each death, his demeanor changing. "This isn't right," he admitted one night, his voice trembling. "It's like the dollhouse is predicting it, or worse, causing it." Marianne couldn't argue. The connection was undeniable. Marianne began to dig deeper into the dollhouse's history, determined to uncover its dark secret. She sought the help of Elijah Black, a local occultist who had a reputation for uncovering the mysteries of cursed objects. "What do you know about the manor that this dollhouse replicates?" she asked him when they met in his dimly lit study. Elijah looked grave. "The manor was cursed, Miss Bell. The house burned down under strange circumstances. There were rumors of a woman, a sorceress who lived there, a woman who dabbled in dark magic. It was said she sought to trap souls inside objects, using forbidden spells to bind them." Marianne's stomach tightened. "And what happened to her?" "The sorceress was killed," Elijah said softly. "But not before she used her power to curse the house, and it seems her curse is still alive, waiting for the right person to release it." Marianne's eyes widened. "The dollhouse? It's her. She's trapped inside." Elijah nodded. "Yes, and now she's using the dolls to exact her revenge. She needs to finish the work she started, and it seems she's chosen you, Miss Bell. You're part of the bloodline that doomed her, part of the family that helped bring about her death." The realization hit Marianne like a bolt of lightning. She had heard stories about her family's history, about the distant ancestors who had been involved in dark dealings, but she never imagined it would come back to haunt her. The sorceress was using the dollhouse to manipulate fate, to reclaim her lost power. And now, it seemed, Marianne was next. The final figure appeared in the dollhouse, Marianne herself. It was a perfect replica, down to the details of her hair and clothes. And when she looked into the doll's glassy eyes, she saw something chilling. The eyes weren't just empty. They were alive. They were watching her. "I can't let this go on," Marianne whispered, a feeling of dread curling in her chest. She knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she grabbed the dollhouse. "I won't let you take anyone else," she said, her voice breaking. And then, in a fit of desperate anger, she hurled the dollhouse to the floor, smashing it into pieces. The room went silent. For a moment, Marianne felt a sense of relief. The curse was broken. The dollhouse was destroyed. But when she looked down, her breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the dollhouse had vanished. And in their place, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, in the center of the floor, was a tiny version of herself, just like the others, perfectly crafted. Marianne reached out in horror, her fingers trembling. And then, with a sickening realization, she felt the walls of the dollhouse close in around her. She was no longer standing in the parlor. She was inside it, inside the dollhouse. Tiny, trapped, screaming. Outside, Victor searched for his wife, calling her name into the empty house. But the dollhouse, once destroyed, remained in the shadows of the past, its curse alive and waiting for the next soul to claim. And somewhere, inside the house, Marianne's tiny figure stood still, her glassy eyes staring blankly into the void. Story number 7. Doll Row was one of those places people forgot about. It was tucked between two busy streets where the stores sold everything from fine china to vintage records. But once, long ago, Doll Row had been alive with the laughter of children, the creak of wooden floors, and the quiet hum of a community thriving on the delicate art of toy making. Now, it was a ghost of its former self. The toy shops that once lined the street had long since closed, leaving behind dusty storefronts and boarded-up windows. The few remaining residents spoke of better times, but no one really remembered what it had been like before. That was until the lullabies started. It began with just one note, a soft, distant melody drifting through the night air. At first, people thought it was the wind or some forgotten tune echoing from the past. But as the nights went on, the lullabies grew clearer, sharper, and impossible to ignore. By midnight, they filled the streets of Doll Row as if the very houses themselves were alive with the haunting sound of a child's song. Detective Iris Quinn had seen enough strange things in her career to ignore a few oddities. But something about the lullabies gnawed at her. She had a knack for finding connections in things that didn't seem to connect, and the eerie music wasn't the only thing out of place in Doll Row. The whole street felt wrong. She could feel it as soon as she stepped onto the cracked pavement. The air was thick with history and sorrow, and she had no choice but to investigate. Iris's first stop was the last remaining toy maker in town, an old man named Vesk, who ran a dusty little shop at the far end of Doll Row. His hands were weathered, his eyes clouded with age, but when he spoke of the street's history, his voice shook. "They used to be good people," he told Iris, his eyes staring out the window at the abandoned shops. "They made toys with their hands, you know? Beautiful things. Wooden soldiers, porcelain dolls. But that was before the fire in '97. After that, it all changed." Iris leaned forward. "What happened in 1897? Vesk's hands trembled as he reached for the wooden cane beside him. "The shopkeepers. They died that night. Every single one of them. All the toy makers. The fire destroyed everything, but it wasn't just the fire that took them. It was the curse. A curse? Iris asked, her interest piqued. Vesk nodded slowly. A doll, a cursed one, named Morel, the spirit of a toymaker's daughter who was killed by a rival. She was the one who brought the curse to Doll Row. Anyone who disrespected the art of toy-making would feel her wrath. Iris's partner, Harlan, a rookie cop fresh from the academy, was skeptical. A curse? Are we really chasing ghosts, Quinn? He asked, rolling his eyes as he flipped through the old records Iris had dug up at the town hall. But Iris had a hunch. She knew there was more to the story than just superstition. The lullabies were too real, too persistent to be dismissed. She began digging deeper, visiting old families who had once lived in Doll Row. As she pieced the story together, it became clear. Morel had been the daughter of a toymaker named Anton Rain. She was his pride and joy, a child prodigy in the art of toy-making. But her life was cut short when a rival toymaker named Elias Grayson murdered her in a jealous rage. Grayson had been jealous of Anton's skill, and in a twisted bid for fame, he killed Morel, setting the wheels of the curse in motion. After her death, the toy shop owners, all friends and colleagues of Anton, began to die one by one. The fire in 1897 had destroyed most of the evidence, but the curse remained. And it wasn't just the toy makers who suffered. The spirits of Doll Row were restless, punishing anyone who disrespected the sacred art of toy making. Those who sold mass-produced toys, those who profited from cheap plastic dolls, would be the next to feel the curse's wrath. As Iris delved deeper into the mystery, she came to realize that the lullabies weren't just haunting the streets. They were a message. The doll Morel, long buried in the ashes of the past, was the key. The music was her way of calling out, of luring people to the street, where she could exact her revenge on anyone who dared to forget the old ways. Iris couldn't ignore it any longer. The curse was real, and Morel was behind it, and the only way to end it was to put the doll to rest. But finding Morel's doll wasn't easy. Iris tracked down a collector named Marnie, a woman with an obsession for rare dolls. Marnie's eyes widened with recognition when Iris showed her a picture of Morel. "You don't understand, Detective," Marnie said, her voice shaking. "That doll, it's not just a doll, it's alive. I've seen it in my collection. It's the source of all this. It's been waiting." Iris's heart sank. "Where is it?" Marnie's hands shook as she pointed toward the back of the shop. "In the attic. But you have to be careful. If it sees you, if it senses that you're trying to destroy it, Morel will make sure you never leave." The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The air was thick with dust, and the sound of the lullaby grew louder, echoing from the shadows. There, in the center of the room, stood the doll, Morel. Her porcelain face was cracked, but her eyes, those cold, glassy eyes, still held a wicked, knowing gleam. The moment Iris stepped forward, the music stopped. Silence. The stillness was suffocating. Iris reached for the doll, her heart pounding in her chest. As her fingers brushed against Morel's cold, brittle skin, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if the doll was alive, aware of her presence. But Iris wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. She lifted the doll into her arms and carried it outside, determined to bury it and end the curse once and for all. As she stood in the middle of Doll Row, her arms heavy with the cursed doll, Iris could feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on her. She buried Morel deep in the earth, whispering a prayer for the souls of the toy makers and their forgotten art. But as she turned to leave, she heard it. the sound of hundreds of tiny voices, all singing in unison, their voices rising like a chorus. Iris turned around, her blood running cold. Every doll in town had turned to face her. Their glassy eyes stared at her with the same hollow, vengeful gaze. The lullaby began again. And this time, it wasn't just one doll. It was all of them. Story number 8. Alice Fenley had seen her fair share of mansions, but none quite like Whitcroft Manor. The grand estate sat at the edge of the village, its towering spires reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping for something long lost. The ivy that clung to the walls was thick and green, but beneath it the stone was cracked and weathered. The manor had an air of neglect, as though it had once been grand, but had been slowly forgotten by time. Alice, a new maid eager to prove herself, arrived with nothing but her suitcase and the hope that this job would be different from the last. She wasn't sure how she felt about working for Lady Whitcroft, the owner of the manor, but her pay was generous, and the opportunity had come at a time when she needed it most. The housekeeper had briefed her quickly, speaking of Lady Whitcroft, with a sense of caution. "Don't bother her too much," the housekeeper warned. "Her ladyship has her ways. She's particular." The first night, Alice was given a room at the far end of the manor, where the corridors grew darker and more oppressive. The house was quiet, too quiet, but she had no choice but to accept it. Her new life had begun. Lady Whitcroft was an imposing figure, elegant and sharp-eyed, but there was something off about her. Alice noticed right away that the lady rarely spoke to anyone, except, that is, for a porcelain doll that she kept close at all times. The doll, named Arabella, sat perched on a velvet cushion, dressed in fine silk, its glass eyes gleaming with an unnatural life. Alice had never seen a doll so carefully maintained, its porcelain face smooth and untouched by age or wear. The first time Alice served Lady Whitcroft in the dining room, she was struck by the strange sight. The lady sat at the head of the table staring intently at Arabella, as though the doll were a person. Lady Whitcroft spoke to it softly, her voice quiet and calm, but Alice couldn't make out the words. The lady's expression shifted as she nodded, occasionally glancing at the servants, but she never spoke to them. It was as if Arabella was the only one worth her attention. Alice found it unsettling, but she said nothing. After all, it wasn't her place to question the lady's behavior. Still, there was something about the way the doll seemed to control her that gnawed at Alice. Days passed, and Alice began to notice the oddities more and more. The lady's commands were always given with the doll's advice, which Alice soon realized wasn't just a silly indulgence. It was serious. The doll seemed to have an influence over the house, and it wasn't long before Alice witnessed the cruelty it inspired. The punishment of servants, the odd and unexplained disappearances, the strange, chilling rituals that the lady enacted. And always Arabella was there, her eyes watching everything, her hands never moving, yet somehow pulling the strings. One night, after overhearing a conversation between the cook and Thomas, the stable boy, Alice learned the grim truth. "She's not who she once was, you know," Cook muttered as she stirred a pot, her face drawn with worry. "Lady Whitcroft. She's been like this ever since the doll arrived. She wasn't always cruel, but now. Well, we all do things we regret." Thomas nodded in agreement, though his eyes were filled with fear. "It's the doll, isn't it? Arabella. She has a power over her. I've seen it. The lady was beautiful once, full of life, but now she's different. Cold, empty, and Arabella feeds on the pain. I'm sure of it." Alice's stomach twisted as she listened. Arabella, The doll was no ordinary toy. There was something sinister in the air, and Alice could feel the weight of it. Determined to uncover the truth, Alice started to dig into the history of Whitcroft Manor, spending hours in the library. What she discovered was far worse than she had imagined. In the dusty pages of an old diary, Alice learned the horrifying story of Arabella. The doll hadn't always been a doll. Arabella had once been a young girl, the beloved daughter of a toy maker, who worked for the Whitcroft family. She had been betrayed by the Whitcrofts, a betrayal that had cost her life. In her rage and pain, Arabella had cursed the family, vowing to haunt them forever. Her spirit, bound to a porcelain doll, would live on, feeding on the suffering of the Whitcrofts and anyone who entered the manor. It didn't stop there. The diary revealed that the lady's continued youth and wealth came at a price. Every act of cruelty, every misdeed, was part of a bargain with the cursed doll. In exchange for Arabella's power, Lady Whitcroft had traded her soul, becoming a hollow shell of who she had once been. But there was something else, something even darker. Alice, she realized, was connected to the curse. She was a blood relative of Arabella. The doll had been waiting for her. She had come to the manor to break the curse, whether she wanted to or not. The night Alice confronted Lady Whitcroft, she knew it was too late. The doll was a monster, and the lady was its puppet. Arabella's voice seemed to echo in Alice's mind, whispering dark promises, manipulating her every thought. But Alice was strong, and she refused to fall under its spell. "I know what you've done," Alice said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "I know what Arabella is, and I won't let you use me." The lady looked at her with vacant eyes, but the doll was the one who spoke. "You cannot escape," Arabella's voice rasped, cold and hollow. "You are mine, just as she was mine. You will break the curse, but not in the way you think." Alice grabbed the doll from the cushion, feeling its cold weight in her hands. With all her might, she hurled it into the roaring fireplace, watching as the flames swallowed it whole. But as the doll burned, something worse happened. The lady shrieked, her body convulsing as if it were being torn apart. She exploded in flames, her body disintegrating into ash. The air grew thick with smoke, and Alice stumbled back, horrified by the sight. The manor, once grand and stately, was now a tomb. But the worst part was that, in the final moments before the fire consumed the cursed doll, Alice saw something chilling in the ashes. The smoke cleared just enough for her to see Arabella's porcelain face, staring back at her, the eyes still open, unblinking. And then, all was silent. The manor stood in ruin, abandoned, with only the charred remains of the doll and Lady Whitcroft to mark the dark history. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could hear the faintest lullaby, soft and distant, like a memory that refused to die. Alice Fenley never spoke of what happened at Whitcroft Manor again. But in the dead of night, sometimes she would hear the faintest whisper, Arabella's voice calling her name. Story number 9. Lenora Vale had always been drawn to the eerie. The way shadows stretched across an empty street, the way silence could feel so heavy it pressed on your chest. It was all like art to her. So, when she came across the old sketchbook in Elijah Grimm's bookshop, her curiosity was immediately piqued. It wasn't much at first, a dusty, leather-bound book filled with loose sketches and half-finished paintings, but then, between the pages, she found it. A faded, yellowed map, drawn in a delicate hand, leading to a place called the Doll's Hollow. Elijah, the bookshop owner, had warned her. "Not many who go looking for that place come back the same, or at all," he'd said, his voice deep and scratchy. But Lenora, ever the artist, wasn't one to shy away from the unknown. She had always been obsessed with the macabre, with the forgotten, with the stories that lived in the cracks of history. So she packed her things and set off for the village marked on the map. The Doll's Hollow was hidden deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The moment Lenora set foot in the village, she felt it. The air was thick, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The houses were rotting, their facades crumbling with age, and the streets were empty. Not a soul in sight. Yet something felt wrong, like the village was holding on to a secret, something buried beneath the dust and decay. Lenora wandered through the narrow, overgrown lanes, the map clutched tightly in her hand. The farther she walked, the more oppressive the silence became. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of her own footsteps. Then she saw them. At first, it was just a glimpse. Something small, perched in the window of a decaying house. A doll. But then she saw another, and another, each one in different windows, their porcelain faces cracked, their eyes unblinking. As she moved deeper into the village, she began to realize the truth. They weren't just dolls. They were alive. She could feel their eyes on her, watching from every corner, every window, every doorway. The longer she stayed, the more she felt the weight of their gaze, like they were judging her, waiting for her to make a mistake. That night, as Lenora sat in one of the abandoned houses, trying to sketch the eerie village, she heard something. A soft tapping on the window. She stood and moved cautiously toward it, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the dark, was a small figure. A girl, dressed in ragged clothes, her eyes wide with something akin to fear. "Are you lost?" Lenora asked, her voice barely a whisper. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a nearby house, and Lenora, confused but intrigued, followed her. Inside the house, the girl, who had the appearance of a doll, her porcelain skin too smooth, her joints too stiff, took Lenora's hand and led her to a room at the back. There, on the wall, were more sketches, drawings of people, no, villagers, and at the center, a strange symbol that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The girl's eyes locked with Lenora's, and she mouthed a single word. "Please." Before Lenora could ask what she meant, a voice, low, guttural, ancient, whispered in her ear, "They can never leave." Lenora's heart pounded as she turned to see the source of the voice. The girl, no longer silent, began to speak in broken whispers, her voice a mixture of desperation and sorrow. "They were once like you," the girl said, her voice trembling. "They tried to escape, just like you, but they couldn't. They turned themselves into dolls to escape the plague. But the curse, it never let them go." Lenora took a step back, her mind racing. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" "I am Matilda," the girl said softly. "I was one of them, one of the villagers who tried to escape. But now, we are all bound here, trapped in our childlike forms. And so are you." Lenora's stomach dropped as she realized the horrible truth. The villagers had turned themselves into dolls to escape death, to escape the plague that ravaged their homes. But the curse they had bound themselves to had not allowed them peace. Instead, it kept them in this hollow village, forever trapped in the form of porcelain dolls, unable to speak, unable to move freely. The worst part? They had been waiting for Lenora, someone from their own bloodline, someone who could finally break the curse. Lenora didn't know how long she had been there, how many days had passed since she first arrived in Doll's Hollow. The village had started to warp around her, its twisted streets and decaying houses beginning to feel more and more like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Every time she tried to leave, the path would shift, leading her back to the same square where the dolls stood, their eyes always following her. It was then that she realized the true horror. The dolls, all of them, were a hive mind, one consciousness, shared by all the villagers who had died and turned into porcelain. They were still there, trapped in their childlike forms, unable to speak, but they could see, they could feel, and they were using Lenora to break the curse, to bring the final piece they needed, her. Her bloodline, her essence, was the last thing needed to complete the transformation. Once they had her, they would finally be free. It happened in the dead of night. Lenora tried to escape one last time, her breath coming in frantic gasps. She reached the center of the square, but the dolls had surrounded her, closing in from every direction. The tiny figures moved with eerie precision, their lifeless eyes unblinking, their hands reaching for her. "No, no!" Lenora screamed as she struggled, but it was useless. They were too strong. The porcelain hands gripped her, pulling her closer to the center of the village, to the place where the final transformation would take place. Matilda, now more like a doll than a girl, stood at the front, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You are our missing piece," she whispered. "With you, we will finally be free." Lenora fought with everything she had, but it was no use. The dolls, with their cold, unyielding strength, pulled her toward the center of the square. And then, in one final, horrifying moment, they turned her into one of them. Her eyes were frozen in mid-scream, her mouth open in a silent cry. Her body, now a cold, lifeless doll. The curse was complete. From that night forward, the village of Dolls Hollow stood silent. The last living soul had been claimed, and the dolls, every single one, stood in their positions, forever watching, forever waiting. And in the center of the square, where Lenora had once stood, a new doll joined the others. Her eyes stared out, frozen in eternal terror, as the rest of the dolls, the forgotten villagers, continued their endless watch over the hollow, waiting for the next soul to arrive. The Dolls' Hollow had claimed another. Story number 10. Dr. Thomas Keene was the kind of man who believed in facts. He had always been a skeptic. Nothing existed unless it could be explained by science, logic, or reason. So, when he inherited Briar Abbey from an aunt he barely remembered, he saw it as nothing more than an inconvenience. The old house was filled with crumbling stone walls, rotting wood, and a long-forgotten history of whispers and superstitions. But it was his now, and the money from selling it could help him rebuild his life after the death of his wife, Eleanor. His daughter, Imogen, was only 9, too young to understand the depth of their loss. She didn't speak much about her mother, but Thomas could see the emptiness in her eyes, the way her small frame seemed to carry a weight too heavy for someone so young. Maybe moving to Briar Abbey would help her, give them both a fresh start. But as they arrived at the mansion, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting for them, its shadows lurking, whispering things he didn't want to hear. The housekeeper, Margaret, was the only staff member left. She had worked at Briar Abbey for years, and her eyes seemed to carry the burden of its dark history. The first time Thomas mentioned the doll, she stiffened. The doll! Margaret's voice trembled and her face grew pale. "It's locked. Away, sir. Best left forgotten." Thomas dismissed her, chalking up her fear to superstition. "I don't believe in such things," he said, more to himself than to her. "Imogen's a bright girl. There's nothing to fear." But that night, Imogen found the doll. It was a simple thing, no bigger than a small child's toy, its porcelain face smooth and unmarked. Imogen had always been drawn to old things, and when she wandered into the nursery, her fingers brushed, against the dusty old chest where the doll had been hidden away. She pulled it out, and for a moment Thomas saw a flicker of excitement in her eyes. "It's just a doll," he told her, smiling softly. "Nothing to be afraid of." But when Imogen began to play with it, her voice changed. The sweet, childish tone she normally used morphed into something else. Something older, deeper. She began to whisper in Latin. At first, Thomas thought it was just her imagination. But as the whispers grew, so did his unease. Imogen was speaking words he didn't understand, phrases that sounded foreign, ancient. When he asked her what she was saying, she simply stared at him, her eyes cold and distant. "I'm playing with her," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "With my friend." The next day, Thomas decided to explore the mansion and its dark corners, hoping to understand more about the house's history. In the attic, he found a collection of old journals belonging to the original lady of the house, Eliza Breyer. As he flipped through the yellowed pages, he discovered the terrible truth. Eliza Breyer had been obsessed with the occult, with summoning spirits and demons to fill the empty void left by her loneliness. She had used the doll in a ritual, one designed to summon a demon disguised as a playmate for her daughter. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. Eliza had bound the demon to the doll, ensuring that it would take on the form of a child's toy, waiting for the right time to strike. The demon had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the next victim. And now, it had found Imogen. As the days passed, Imogen's behavior grew stranger. She no longer spoke to Thomas the way she once had. Instead, she spent hours in the nursery, her whispers growing louder. Her small, fragile body seemed to grow more distant, as if she were slipping away into the doll's world. Thomas could feel the change in the air, the house growing colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. One night, in a moment of desperation, Thomas called Father Alton, the local priest. The old man had lived near Briar Abbey for many years and knew its dark past better than anyone. When he arrived at the house, his eyes darkened with recognition. "Father, what's happening to Imogen?" Thomas asked, his voice frantic. Father Alton sighed heavily. "The demon is not after her, Thomas," he said. "It's after you." The priest explained that the demon had always needed a final sacrifice to complete its power, a soul to feed on. Thomas was the final piece. He was the one who could release the demon from its prison if only he gave in. But why me? Thomas asked, his voice trembling. "You have the bloodline, Thomas," Father Alton replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are connected to the family that first summoned the demon. It's been waiting for you." That night, Thomas watched as the demon's influence over Imogen grew stronger. She no longer seemed like his daughter. Her eyes had grown dark, her face pale and lifeless, like something was sucking the life out of her. And all the while, the doll sat in the corner of the room, its empty eyes watching them both. Thomas knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Imogen suffer any longer. But how could he protect her? How could he stop a demon bound to a toy? A creature so powerful it had controlled the house for centuries? In the final moments, Thomas made the ultimate decision. He entered the nursery, the doll sitting there, its porcelain face staring at him with a twisted, knowing smile. Imogen was standing in the corner, her body rigid, her eyes lifeless. "I'm sorry, Imogen," he whispered as he walked toward the doll. "I'll protect you." With a surge of strength, he grabbed the doll, feeling its cold, unnatural weight in his hands. The whispers filled the room, echoing in his mind, driving him mad with their hunger. But he didn't falter. He knew what he had to do. With a final desperate cry, he threw the doll into the fireplace, watching it burn. knowing that the demon would burn with it. But as the fire crackled and Imogen's body slumped in relief, Thomas felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned around to find himself staring into the face of the doll, its porcelain eyes gleaming as it sat in the ashes, untouched. Before he could scream, the world around him went black. The next morning, the house was silent. Imogen was free, but Thomas was gone. The doll, however, had vanished, leaving only the lingering smell of smoke and the faint whispers of a forgotten past. Months later, in a faraway orphanage, a new doll appeared, nestled among the other toys. Its porcelain face was flawless, its eyes wide with a frozen scream, forever trapped in the form of a child's playmate. And in the shadows of Briar Abbey, the demon waited once more, ready for its next victim.